All right, good. All right, I'd like to start the meeting. Let's get started. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Well, why don't we go around and do some introductions, just who you are and your title. We'll start
I'll get
with
started.
John.
John Rankin, Chief Fire Marshal, Town of Southampton.
Ryan Murphy, Town Code Compliance and Emergency Management Administrator for the Town of Southampton.
Okay, Maria Moore, Town Supervisor.
Jim Kiernan, Town of Southampton Chief of Police.
Ann Wilkers, Suffolk County Legislator.
Janice Shearer, Town Planning and Development Administrator.
Seth Race, planner.
And then on Zoom,
And on Zoom, we have
George Mutu, Planning Board Member.
and
Cindy McNamara, Town Council. I'm sorry, I apologize, I don't have enough Wi-Fi availability to have both audio and video, so I chose audio.
that's best.
and then we
Okay,
have two.
Bill Obercare from NYSERDA's Clean Energy Siting Team.
Thank you. All right, so as you know, we've formed this committee to consider the town's existing code for battery energy storage systems with capacities in excess of the 600 kilowatts. And in light of recent events and fires and concerns raised by the town's planning board and the fire district, we're looking to amend the current code. And to give ourselves the opportunity to do this, we've adopted a local law to have a moratorium in place through August 13th. So 2024, so between now and then, we have several meetings planned, and we'll discuss possible code changes. And it'll be, today, you know, we'll invite industry experts like we have today from NYSERDA and PSEG. And we'll meet with local fire chiefs and invite some leaders from other towns since, you know, we're all going through the same things, and some of them have formed working groups as well. And you know, it'd be good to take a regional approach to the issue, and because we all need to find a safe way to store our renewable energy. So with that said, perhaps Janice, you could just give us an overview of the current code section.
Sure.
Summary.
So if I could turn everyone's attention, and I hope that those on Zoom have this. If you don't, Seth can email it to you. But the Battery Energy Storage System Special Exception Code is known as Chapter 330, Section 162.21. And those are the standards for, you know, basically commercial scale battery energy storage systems. And then we've handed out a table of uses as to where these systems were allowed previously, previous to all of the, you know, fire and things that started happening when, you know, we put it out. And we did work with NYSERDA using the model code to develop this. And but the biggest thing we've heard since, you know, obviously all the safety concerns are absolutely important, and that is still getting worked out, I think, with the state committees, and we'll hear more about that. It's just the biggest thing was to, you know, really look at the utility scale battery energy storage in residential zones. So that is kind of the first order, I think, of the code that we would kind of take a look at. And then going on from there, what other considerations, and maybe Bill, you can cue us in on what's going on at the state level and what the recommendations might be. And we'll have like a little bit of our agenda for you to talk more about that. But really,
The current code doesn't
This
have
is
a
the-
cap on it, correct?
right, and so that was the other big question, is we didn't have a threshold for above 600 kilowatt hours. We weren't expecting 100 megawatt. We don't know, you know, where that threshold is, so we would like to know what we should be capping at. You know, that's one of the technical considerations we want to understand. And then we,
And then the locations are currently limited to what? Is it
So the
anywhere?
Well, the locations were, so if you look at the classifications here, the light industrial zones would obviously be, that's sort of the first order. And then-
If I may, on map 1.
Yeah.
At the bottom, on the key, you'll see all of the zones that are permitted by town code as of now.
As of now, and so we would be looking, so we had the light industrial, which starts with LI 40 and LI 200. Then we had the commercial zones because it made sense that maybe a shopping center wanted to have battery storage at the shopping center for like the refrigeration, or maybe they had solar on their roofs or something along those lines. The business districts had it, and then we had multifamily, and then just 2 residential zones, R60 and R80. Which made up a significant, and the criteria for that was that they had to be oversized. They had to be bigger than what would be allowed for a house. So the first map, we show all those zones in orange. And we also added the sand mines just so that that might come up. We just thought that was a good, snapshot. And then, and like everyone is aware, all of the safety considerations and potential concerns and definite concerns from residents is about having them in their neighborhoods, et cetera. The second map shows what would that look like if all those residential were removed. So the second map in the sequence that you have there shows if we were to take off every residential zone where it is from, which is really only the multifamily zone and the 2 R60, R80. R40, R20, it was never allowed. So there was never any ability to put it there in the first place. So this hatched map shows the residential best zones removed. And then the next map, the third map in the series, then gets into, okay, well then what's left? And so if we all agree with that basic premise that let's just start by removing the residential zones, take it off the table, so we're not, there's no we'd like to hear more from LIPA and NYSERDA about that. But that was the thinking, of the board after all the hearings and all the issues was, all right, let's just see about what if we removed all that and left the light industrial and commercial zones, what would that look like?
Oh, the hatched out marks on the second map show where the residential were.
Yeah.
And then the third map, it's just clear without
What's
some-
left? Yeah, it's just to make it easier. And then the maps after that are just kind of parcel-specific aerials, drilling into those areas where then it potentially would be permitted. And then we would have to, as our work here, get back into the code and make sure that all the criteria is still appropriate.
This was helpful to have it broken down this way.
Really
Thank
helpful
you.
map, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
thought that was easier to see, like the progression, and
sure.
that really is Seth.
Thank
So,
you, Seth.
thank you, Seth.
Excellent.
Excellent planner. So, yeah.
Really well.
Happy to hear it.
Yeah, so you could see, the first is everything that we allowed across the board. The second is if you just took residential off, the few residential zones we allowed. And then the third is what are we left with? And then we would like to know, is that enough to succeed in renewable energy, storage? And what would that look like?
And
So that-
even with these, the ones that are left, we might want to talk about putting some restrictions in terms of, like we did with the cannabis, can't be within a certain distance from a school. I don't know what that'll do to the map, but
Right, and we'd like some specific guidance on that from NYSERDA, and we'd like to understand what the state is thinking and what we should be doing. So, I think, I'm not sure if Ryan or John, you have any info now on the state sort of
yeah,
where we
because
are?
we did review the governor's preliminary report, and our emergency management administrator, Ryan Murphy, and our chief fire marshal, John Rankin, provided the board with some comments in response to those preliminary recommendations. So if you are okay with that, why don't you just summarize what you thought about the New York State?
Sure. So the state had formed a working group to analyze some possible recommendations to the state code to address some of the battery energy storage development and concepts that are coming up, because as is often the case with the state code, it tends to be a little bit behind development, right? The state code is largely built off of the international code. So as things change, as technologies change and development concepts change, those tend to be reflected in the I codes first, and then there's a lag in that, and then once they're in there, then the state at some point following that adopts that code and makes some, typically New York State, specific modifications to the code. So you have a first lag between when the technology changes and the development concepts change and when it goes into the I code, and then you have a second lag between when it goes from the I code into the New York State code. So all things considered on that, that could mean that the code can sometimes be a couple of years even behind new technologies and developments. So this working group that was formed by the state at the request of the governor's office proposed a variety of different recommendations and changes to try and address some of the concerns with regards to battery energy storage within the state code, specifically looking at, I think, the fire code most specifically, but also this comes into play with the building code. Our review largely found that the recommendations of the interagency working group were well thought out, and we favored most of the proposals of the interagency working group, which were looking to try and heighten and enhance the safety, particularly the safety and the fire code requirements, and a lot of that reflected back to lessons learned from some of the research that FDNY has done, UL has done in conjunction with FDNY, as well as NFPA 855, National Fire Protection Association regulations. And NFPA 855 has quite a bit of, it really deals with battery energy storage. And the state has not adopted NFPA 855 into its code yet. So that's one thing that, we've, from the kind of the beginning of these conversations, we've been pushing that perhaps even at a local level, it's something that we may want to look at as a stronger regulation to consider, not even waiting until the state adopts 855, but, if possible, looking at the town to maybe adopt NFPA 855 as a reference standard for some of its construction and development. So that's just kind of a synopsis of kind of our thoughts on without going into like every single aspect of the interagency working group's recommendations. That was a kind of our overview of the evaluation that we conducted on their suggestions.
May I add one or two items?
Thank you, Ryan.
The title of NFPA 855 is Standards for the Installation of Stationary Energy Storage Systems. So it is right on point with what we would need from the state. So if that was adopted, that would be excellent. I would point out too, though, it's, as far as I know, from 2020. So again, there's our lag time, adopting something that might be already out of date. And I would also point out that the interagency task force is still ongoing, and they are still undergoing root cause analysis for the 3 fires that took place in New York. So there are still some findings to be made and suggest recommendations forthwith from the task force.
Thank you, that's important to know.
Yeah, overall, I think that this is a great opportunity, and us looking at this is very forward-thinking and trying to be proactive about it. As with many, new technologies and stuff, things like that, there's still lessons being learned as it's going on. Some of the locations that did experience problems with facilities, I think there's still analysis, of what occurred, what may have been generated by what occurred, testing of those types of, substances, things like that, trying to really figure out, because what's there, but then you want to know what did the reaction produce? Is that different than what we knew to be there, beforehand? So At the same time that I think we're taking a really positive action here by looking at this and trying to figure out what might be best practices, we also have to recognize that while we're doing this, we're still learning things globally. The whole industry, the fire protection industry, the building codes industry, the energy systems industry are all still, learning things. It's a positive effort to try and figure out ways that we can be more, energy conscious, but we're also still figuring it out while we go.
Maybe we
Exactly
can
right.
talk to Bill Oberker and hear where they are in the state for a little while.
Yeah, let's do that. Bill's with us from NYSERDA.
Yep.
Sure, thanks. Happy to address some things. But before I do that, I just want to clear up a few, factual errors so far. The section 1206 of the New York State Fire Code currently, that's the section that deals with energy storage systems at the New York level. That is based on the 2021 International Fire Code, which is based on the 2020 NFPA 855. So if you do a side-by-side comparison of the 2020 NFPA 855 and section 1206 of the current New York State Fire Code, you're going to see a lot of very, very similar language. So the NFPA standard has always been at the heart since the 2020 version was released. The NFPA 855 2023 edition is at the heart of the 2024 International Fire Code, which was just released, I believe, in the beginning of this year. So this, when we talk about 855 and the International Fire Code and the New York State Code, we're really talking about the same thing with a few minor differences, particularly where we come down to New York State. And the reason for the differences in New York State are primarily because New York State is home to the FDNY. And because of that, New York has been ahead of the curve in energy storage fire safety because FDNY is really the first organization nationally who says, wait a minute, it's great that the industry is saying that, these things are safe and they're in your cell phone and they're in your computer. FDNY is the first fire department to say, you have to prove that they're safe. And that's how we get the UL 9540A test, Underwriters Laboratory 9540A, which is the main fire test for energy storage systems. That's largely a collaboration between UL and FDNY. So where we see the different New York-specific regulations for energy storage, a lot of that is kind of taking regulations that were in the city and applying them to the state. Same with the recommendations from the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group. I would say upwards of 90% of that is just taking ideas that FDNY has put into their regulations, trying to figure out how to adapt them to work on the state level. So that's really where almost all of this is coming from, is the work that's been done in New York City, and then the work that's been done that builds off the work in New York City, which is, former FDNY and current FDNY staff have great representation on the NFPA 855 committee, the International Fire Code Committee, the International Code Council. So these are really the same folks who are working on these standards from a variety of different ways, and we have quite a few of those folks advising the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group as well. So I just want to make clear that the line between 855 and IFC and our fire code here in New York is a very blurry line. It's a lot of people kind of taking the same ideas and making them and kind of just tweaking them a little bit to work in a specific context. So I think that's probably the best possible overview here, is to say that the base standard is NFPA 855. That is the standard from which all other standards have come historically. That's very important to understand. The Fire Safety Working Group released those code recommendations that were referenced earlier to the public. Anyone can go on the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group website, download a copy of that, read it through. They were released for public comment in early February. Right now, the working group is in the process of incorporating relevant public comments. As with any public comment process, some comments were off the mark. Others were comments about things that the fire safety working group had already considered and kind of came to a conclusion. And then others were things that, you know, were very useful insights that had not been considered before. And right now what the working group is doing is incorporating those to amend the recommendations accordingly before handing them over to Department of State. So Department of State will then get an updated memo with the code recommendations, which they are going to release for public comment again through the rule and development release for the fire code. We would expect that to happen early summer. So there will be another public comment on the next iteration of those fire code recommendations. And then finally, per the last code council meeting, there will be yet another public release through SAPA, or the State Administrative Procedures Act, and we would expect that to happen in fall of this year. So if folks are interested and would like to be engaged, there are still a couple more opportunities to weigh in, particularly folks in the fire service, you know, particularly folks that serve as an AHJ or authority having jurisdiction for their community, planning board folks. You know, there's still time to weigh in there on those recommendations. Even if you're just weighing in with concerns, if you don't have solutions, that's perfectly fine. It's still very helpful for the working group to hear, you know, where people are throughout the state, because we have varying levels of development throughout the state, which means folks have varying levels of experience with this technology, so we have varying levels of kind of issues and perspectives on this technology throughout the state. And it's very helpful at the working group level to be able to understand that better through these public comments.
Bill, can I ask a question? Just quick. Do you expect the state to sort of, these recommendations would become standards in fire protection code? And that's what we're talking about here? Or is it sort of, what will happen when, like, what if we had we would adopt that then? Or it would just become state code? How does the municipality work within that framework is my real question.
So for all fire code, the New York State Uniform Code is the baseline. That establishes the minimum standard for construction and development. That's what we're talking about here. The Uniform Code is adopted by the New York State Code Council. So the audience for that fire code recommendation memo was the New York State Code Council for incorporation into the Uniform Code, which then goes into effect statewide once it's implemented, with the exception of New York City, who are currently permitted to retain their own code. Every other jurisdiction in the rest of the state, once the state implements the Uniform Code, that becomes the new baseline. And Home Rule Authority works a bit differently with the Uniform Code than it does with land use, say, which is inherently entirely local. For the Uniform Code, there is a specific process through Department of State that local governments have to go through this process, and they are only allowed to make the requirements in the Uniform Code more stringent. So you can't use your Home Rule Authority to relax the Uniform Code. You can't use Home Rule Authority to make the Uniform Code more stringent through a formal process with Department of State. But that is not appropriate for land use regulations. I like to put it this way. Land use regulations are not appropriate for mitigating fire hazards. Land use regulations are appropriate for designated areas where that level of fire hazard is acceptable. That's the key difference. We have the fire code, which is responsible for mitigating the fire hazard, and then we have our land use regulations that determine, you know, what are the parameters under which we are willing to cite this particular level of fire hazard in our community. I think that's a really important thing to understand in this context.
Thanks for clarifying that.
We were joined by Gary Stevenson from LIPA.
Oh, good.
He's right there.
Hi, Gary. Gary Stevenson from LIPA. Thanks for joining our conversation today.
Yeah, sorry I was late. I was on the wrong Zoom link there.
I thought so.
So I just had a couple of brief comments. So first, I just wanted to say thank you for asking me to participate today on behalf of LIPA. You know, I'm certainly open to questions as we go through this, so feel free to stop me. I guess I'd like to preface the discussions with just a reminder that our job utility serving our customers on the island is to balance three things. The first is providing affordable energy. The second is providing clean energy, preferably carbon-free, emissions-free energy. And then finally, really importantly, it's ensuring that we maintain outstanding reliability. We recently issued an IRP, an integrated resource plan, that essentially looks out into the future to 2040, just to make sure that we could continue to do those three things that I mentioned: affordable, clean, reliable energy. I won't get into the details of the IRP, but I just wanted to say that one of the key themes, if you were to flip through it, is that we really can't run the grid, the electric grid, without some sort of energy storage. It's absolutely indispensable. So, for the last 100 or so years, we've relied, especially on Long Island, on fossil fuels to provide that energy storage, in the form of coal and oil and natural gas, kerosene, propane, all those things. Those have been the preferred form of storage for a very long time. And those fuels were stored somewhere, in a tank, in a mine, an underground reservoir somewhere, so that we could burn it when we needed it. That was kind of the equation for a very long time in the electric industry. So, move ahead.
Oh, go ahead, because George was not muted. Keep going, Gary.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, obviously under Governor Hochul's leadership, we're transitioning away from those fuels, and so the question is, what replaces it? Right now, it appears to us that batteries are probably the most promising technology. LIPA customers have already installed over 2,000 systems in their homes, so we've got a lot of customers who are very comfortable with the technology. At the utility scale, we're aiming for 750 megawatts of battery systems by 2030. And just to give you a sense, the East Hampton battery is 5, so we've got a long way to go. So we've got a lot to do in this area. Batteries have some really great features from our perspective. It gives us the ability to place on-demand energy very close to where it's needed. That's especially important given the difficulty building new transmission and distribution lines pretty much anywhere. The instant response to manage peak load that comes from batteries is really also very important. That helps us reduce reliance on running the fossil fuel peaker plants that we have scattered through the system that are relatively less clean, less efficient. And then batteries also help us avoid curtailment of all the renewable energy that's coming on the system, the offshore wind, the solar, and all that. That renewable energy has zero variable cost, so we never want to curtail it. We really want to minimize the number of hours where it has to be curtailed, because it's cheap and it's free effectively once it's built, and of course it's carbon free. And then the last thing to mention about batteries is that it really is important to help us improve our resiliency. And one example is, I'm aware of, is Cape Cod, which is kind of a similar sort of electrical situation, similar to the South Fork of Long Island. And there, the local utility has installed a battery-fed microgrid, basically to keep people on during a storm for a certain number of hours, and that's really, batteries do that in a way that's clean and reliable. So now, just to kind of wrap it up, as I think about the South Fork, just generally, it's been an area of consistent load growth for us on Long Island. Most of the rest of the island has been flat in terms of load growth, but the South Fork sort of stands out as the area that's been seeing increasing load. So we've got some major decisions on the horizon, I think. We need to answer the question, what kind of energy infrastructure is going to get built on the South Fork? And in my mind, the potential options are, we could build sources of energy that are distant and use high voltage lines to get it there, but then we'll be building substations somewhere on the South Fork. And those substations come with lots of inherent electrical infrastructure, things like big transformers that are filled with oil that they're not risk-free. The second option would be to site the generation locally, which has got its own set of challenges, and then maybe some combination of those two. And so I guess just to wrap it up, I'm very sympathetic, we're very sympathetic at LIPA to the need to completely understand the risks associated with batteries. And we're here to support you through the process.
Thank you, Gary. So back to that threshold question, to that, and on any one site, obviously the objective in one realm is, as much as you can put there, but there's this competing objective of, we don't want to max out any one location to the extent that it would cause a nuisance. So how do you kind of balance those two objectives? Either one of you could answer that.
Yeah, from our perspective, we want both. We want sort of a diversified portfolio of batteries. So we think there's a continuing need for the small ones, the 5 megawatts and below. And those are, just by their nature, tend to be on our distribution circuits. So sort of interwoven into the communities maybe more tightly than the bigger industrial scale 50 megawatts, 75 megawatts, 100 megawatt batteries. And so from our perspective, we need a mix of both large ones and small ones. We're not going to achieve our goals with 2 or 3 large batteries. It's going to be a mix.
But could you safely say that 2 or 3 large sites would fulfill the needs of extra capacity out here on the South Fork? Is that?
Probably not.
No. Is there a mega wattage that you would say the South Fork requires in order to meet our demands?
Yeah, you said 750, but
There is because of the electrical infrastructure out there to begin with, it's very unlikely that we're going to be putting in large, 150 megawatt batteries out pretty far on the island on the South Fork. It's hard to tell you a specific number, but it's going to be, I think, multiple sites that are probably significantly less than 50 megawatts.
so then can you explain that a little more about power purchase agreements and what the, sort of utility is looking for? And so we had an application for a very large storage facility, but that may or may not have been something that the utility agreed to. So the question I have is sort of which comes first, and we would not like to be first. We would like to know that someone has an actual agreement, but we assume the utility wants to know that they have control of a site. So that's another kind of chicken and egg thing that we would, I think, need to understand a little better.
Yeah, so depending on the size, it either connects to the distribution system or connects to the transmission system. If it connects to the transmission system, which would be, say, in the Riverhead area, it needs to go through the New York ISO queue process, the interconnection queue, to get basically the approval and authority to inject energy into the system. So typically that is done sort of on a coincident basis with the PPA. So we'll be working with a developer who maybe has a queue position, they're called. So it may not be a firm agreement yet, but we kind of look at it and say these guys or gals have a really good shot at getting their interconnection request approved, and therefore it would be something that we would entertain entering into discussions with respect to a PPA. And then on the smaller ones, LIPA does that itself. It analyzes through our service provider, PSEG. We'll analyze the electrical characteristics where that smaller developer wants to inject energy to make sure that the system can handle it. And if the system can't handle it then there are upgrades associated with that, and the developer pays those. And that smaller ones don't necessarily need to be PPAs. There are different structures whereby we can accept that energy. There are multiple sort of avenues there. And then the third thing that I should probably mention is, NYSERDA is doing a tremendous amount in this area, and we kind of, they've kind of built a pretty big engine to do procurement of large-scale renewables. So certainly at LIPA, we want to work very closely with NYSERDA as some of the larger battery systems get installed on the island.
So then just to follow up with that, and the basis of the model code was sort of these tiering of, installations, let's say, like a small tier, mid-tier, and then 600 kilowatt and above. And Bill, would you say then is the NYSERDA model code going to be updated or reconsidered for like what we're talking about? Like maybe, the smaller ones, like Gary just said, go through LIPA, a larger one, and then there seems to be maybe a cap. If you're not going to approve something more than 50 megawatts, let's say, why even have it open-ended? And then everyone gets sort of upset when someone comes in with a real big application that may or may not even be accepted. Is that something we can figure out?
Sure. Right now, there are no plans to update the model law. A lot of that is, as I said before, we're worried about dealing with fire hazards here. Zoning is not the appropriate place to deal with fire hazards. And I think a lot of, for a long time, should we update the model law was just kind of on the back burner until we figure out the fire code recommendations with the interagency working group. And then now that that is a bit more clear than it was, it doesn't really seem like there's a need to update the model law. That said, the model law is a template. It is designed to be modified by communities. So where there is a desire or a need for Southampton to cut battery energy storage systems off at 50 megawatts, I'm not going to recommend that to you, but just the way that home rule authority works with local land use regulations, that is an option to the community. One thing to be careful though with bans, as Gary mentioned, NYSERDA has a large-scale renewables program. That large-scale renewables program mostly has projects that are permitted by the state's Office of Renewable Energy Siting. So the Office of Renewable Energy Siting does not permit standalone batteries. So the only time the Office of Renewable Energy Siting has purview over a battery is when it's connected to renewable generation, whether that's solar, whether that's wind, and then that battery is going to fall under the jurisdiction of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting because they're going to look at the whole thing as one project. As folks likely know, at this point, the Office of Renewable Energy has a provision whereby it is allowed to invalidate unreasonably burdensome components of local laws. Unreasonably burdensome is the language that they use. It's not, my characterization right here. That's the language in the regulations. So what happens then is if there is a project under the jurisdiction of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, and then there is one clause or one provision in a law that is stopping that project from being built, the developer can challenge that, and then that will go before an adjudicatory law judge who will make a decision as to whether or not that provision is unreasonably burdensome. Very important to take note that they're not looking at the whole law. They're just looking at that one piece that is blocking this development. So this is all going somewhere. If you have bans, say nothing over 50, and you end up in that situation where there's a solar project with a 50 megawatt battery that's under the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, and that ban on 50 megawatts and above is the only thing preventing that project, there's probably a pretty good chance that the ALJ, adjudicatory law judge, is going to deem that as unreasonably burdensome. In fact, any ban or moratorium is typically not considered by ORES. They just don't really look at that when they're making the decision. However, if you do have land use regulations, say you establish a different set of setbacks for 50 megawatts and up, establish different zones where that's permissible or not permissible, ORES will take all of that into consideration. So think, it's better in the long term where you cover all of your bases if instead of saying we're going to cap development at 50 megawatts, instead of doing that, go the route of, okay, we understand that 50 megawatts is a much more significant land use. So we're going to have a lot more, regulations around that. We understand that might need a larger setback, or even though the substation is in a residential area, there's no way that we want a 50 megawatt battery in any residential area, so we're not gonna allow that in residential area. You know, those are the types of things that are going to give you more of a voice and more standing if the state permitting office is to get involved. So I still recommend to everyone, you know, even if you don't want batteries of that size, then go through the work to try to mitigate your concerns to the extent that you possibly can, rather than just taking an easier way out and banning it. Because that more thoughtful approach, if you get in the position where the authority is not entirely in local hands, that more thoughtful approach is going to give you a lot more standing and a lot more influence over how that decision is made than if you just say, we're not going to tolerate that. Because that's, as I said, very likely to get thrown out. So I think that's the case for very big ones. You know, NYSERDA's model law is gonna stick, at least for the near term, with 600 kilowatt hours. So below 600 kilowatt hours is gonna be considered a small system. We found that to be still pretty much true. It would be rare to see a 600 battery that's below 600 kilowatt hours that's really, you know, at the grid scale, directly connected to the grid. If, however, you know, the local community wants to do something different, wants to be a little bit more specific, then residential batteries are capped by the code at 80 kilowatt hours. And then the next threshold established in the code is the 600 kilowatt hour. And then the threshold that where ORES kicks in, again, not for standalone energy storage, but for other projects where ORES has jurisdiction, that's 25 megawatts. So if there is need for more granular regulations for different types of systems, you know, you could very reasonably cap residential projects at 80 kilowatt hours. We'll call them small commercial projects. We're going to cap those at 600 kilowatt hours. And then for the grid scale projects, we'll cap that at 25 megawatts. And then above that, you know, we're going to have a different set of regulations that are going to give us a seat at the table for the very, very large systems, like saying we're only going to put those in industrial areas or things of that nature. But as I explained it, there is a chance that it will backfire if you just say, you know, we don't want that in the community, period. It does benefit you to put more thoughtful regulations around that size.
Just to add a little bit to what Bill just said, you know, from my perspective, really I threw out 50 as sort of a reasonable number. You know, it's really about economics from a developer's perspective in part. And so if the developer was interested in spending a fair amount of money on system upgrades, it could be bigger. But just the electrical system as it stands today, it's a difficult area. As you go out that south fork, it's just a difficult area to build big batteries. The exception, of course, is if you were to couple it with renewables, right? If it was sitting behind a solar system or behind some of the wind, then you could do that.
Bill, can I ask you, sorry, Gary, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So if a developer made a pitch to, you know, do a utility scale battery system that's nowhere close to an interconnection point suitable to life, close to a substation or anything like that, that's in a location that may be determined to be acceptable, you know, sometime in the future. Would LIPA be amenable to doing the utility or the infrastructure upgrades to accept that energy into its grid, or would the developer then have to do that?
Usually it's the developer has to pay for upgrades to deliver that energy to the grid. That's
So
typically.
that could be substantial depending on where this is located.
Yeah, which is why I said, you know, the 50 megawatts, it's a gray area, but it's driven, I think, mostly by economics, because those upgrades start to become, you know, those substantial dollars you're talking about. So it makes the project look less economic versus, say, somewhere further west.
May I
And
follow?
you mentioned earlier that, I'm sorry.
I was just going to follow up on the same vein. I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Is there a distance that you have in mind, Gary, about proximity for the distribution, for linking into the distribution system? Is there some way we can think of this spatially, before you get into transmission bridges and large infrastructure projects?
Yeah, it's tough to quote a number. It gets into what, just what distribution costs per mile, let's say. And that is gonna vary tremendously by location. If it's underground, it could be, we could be talking about, $5 million a mile for distribution. And so, at least, so it's very hard to quote a number there. So the closer to the distribution system, the closer to the substation, the more economic it'll be.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you, George.
Yeah.
Yes. So I guess the other question I was wondering, you mentioned earlier on, the growth in energy demand on the South Fork over the last, decade or many years you're talking about. And with the code that we have right now that goes up to 600 kilowatts, I've been to presentations from in other locations where companies like Generac, in other places in the country, are actively providing these batteries up to 1 megawatts behind the meter, not connected to the grid, but behind the meter to assist with developments, industrial developments. It might be, in the LI 40 areas or small manufacturing factories, which, they use it for peak shaving, for providing power in the afternoons when the rates are higher, and take that off the grid. If that's incentivized on the South Fork to people, who have businesses and, might be apartment complexes or whatever, how much would that assist with the demand over the long term?
Yeah, it's a good question. That will help. That will help a lot. The challenge that we face, that's kind of what we call the mid-tier or the retail storage, sometimes people call it. So getting batteries behind the meter, or especially for commercial and industrial customers, that can help them shape their peak and reduce their demand charges. It's got some resiliency benefits as well. But again, it's we need a diversified portfolio. We won't get to our 750 megawatt goal doing strictly behind the meter batteries. We need some big ones.
But that could be a component of
Yes.
the whole thing, right?
So behind the meter would count towards your 750 goal, or no?
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat that, please?
So
the mic.
if the storage is post meter, does that count towards your system goals of 750? Like even just on a residential basis, these Tesla Powerwall style type residential storage. I didn't think that was counting into your goals of system storage. Yours was like interconnected into the system, not necessarily for the after the meter for the private consumer, whether that's commercial or residential or whatever. Or am I understanding that wrong?
Yeah, no, that's part of our goals. We have our Utility 2.0 filing, which talks about all of our energy storage goals, and so that's a key part of it. It's behind the meter residential storage. And like I said, we have 2,000 of those systems already, and we incent those so customers can get the benefits of storage within their homes.
Gary, when you say 750 megawatt goal, what's the geographic area that you're referring to?
Oh, sorry, can you just repeat that, please?
What's the geographic area for that 750 megawatt goal?
Got it. So we think that Long Island is a great place for batteries, notwithstanding, we've got to get through these moratoriums and site them in the right places. So we're, like I said, totally sympathetic to getting that right. But, the reality is that the island has a lot of dirty fossil generation. That's all of downstate does. New York City does as well. Most of the legacy emissions-free generation has been upstate, in the form of hydro and nuclear. land-based wind. So as more offshore wind comes online, and we expect a lot of it will, we need batteries that are close to it so that we can store that energy. And it's also, we've got a lot of exposure on Long Island because we're an island, right? So it's very helpful, like any island, very helpful to have local energy. So we expect most of that, to be on Long Island itself, pretty much spread probably, I don't know, I'm not sure if it'll be spread evenly, we'll see. But it's gonna be in Nassau County, it'll be in Suffolk County.
Okay.
I think the last conversations we had with PSEG indicated that in their service distribution territory for Long Island, right now, they have, about 25 meg total?
We have 2 batteries, both are 5 megawatts. That's East Hampton, one where we had the fire. Of course, these are via PPA. So NextEra and National Grid are the owners of that facility. And then one out at Montauk. Those are both 5 megawatts, so 10 megawatts right now. And we're very close to signing PPAs with 3 more. They are both in Nassau and Suffolk County. Let's see, yeah, so two are 50 megawatts and one is 79 megawatts.
I actually had a question, if I could, real quick, for Bill. Bill, you had mentioned the Office of Renewable Energy overriding local zoning. Is that only when a battery energy storage system is connected to a renewable power source, or does it also include standalone grid-scale battery energy storage?
Only when it's connected to a renewable power source, that's what puts it under the jurisdiction of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. Standalone energy storage is always permitted at the local level.
Okay, and then the second part of that question is, can the Office of Renewable Energy override moratorium to add battery energy storage to a solar project?
The Office of Renewable Energy Siting is not adding or subtracting things from projects. They're a permit authority. They're a jurisdictional authority. They are evaluating projects that are project applications that developers are submitting to them. So they're largely agnostic to where things go, to what components there are to a project. They're reactive. The developers are securing the sites, figuring out what type of project they're going to build, how big it's going to be. They're putting all that into an application to submit to the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. So the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORES, that's what we call it. It's much easier to say. ORES is never going to say thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that to a developer for a particular project. They're not going to say you must add storage to this. It doesn't work that way.
But if a developer brings them a 5 megawatt solar project with battery energy storage, can they override the moratorium for the battery energy storage portion of it?
No, because that would not be under their jurisdiction.
It would have to be over
However,
25 megawatt, like you said, right?
Over 25, okay.
If they brought a 25 megawatt solar project with 5 megawatts of storage, that would be under the jurisdiction of ORES, and they would be able to toss out that moratorium in that case. But
Okay.
the generation is what's triggering ORES. It's not the storage.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question, if you don't mind, and that is, we're often asked to provide a sort of energy blueprint, so-called, to know exactly where we want to put these renewable, projects, and we've tried to create sort of a level playing field and put, some parameters around that. Is such a blueprint, do you think, possible? Is that kind of what your Utility 2.0 is, or is that something we can look to for guidance to create, to steer people more specifically to, or we just use our best sense of, well, these are industrial areas, so this makes sense, or, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so we have looked at, I think, all of our distribution circuits across the island and done sort of a hosting, they call it hosting capacity, determining for each of those circuits how much renewable energy we can accept. And so we've got pretty detailed maps that I can guide you to that are a start at least to determine, where can we plug these things in and not cause a reliability problem.
That would be great. Thank you.
I'd like to just jump in on that question if I could. There are also zoning tools that can really help with that. Like say we don't want any energy storage in residential districts, but energy storage goes where, to provide the most benefit, it goes where the substations go, which has come up already. There are substations in residential districts. We have zoning tools that can say, okay, we don't want this in residential districts, but we're gonna create floating zones or overlay zones within a certain radius of where these substations are, so that only these little pieces of the residential district where they have the extenuating circumstances of being home to a substation, that's what we're going to open up to this development. Anything else in a residential district, then, it's not appropriate to have megawatt scale development. So you can use these zoning tools to be able to kind of cut out that, more nuanced and more specific vision of where these projects can go.
With like a threshold, like we could say only 5 megawatt or something, not 100 potentially, right? Like you could still also say these are floating zones and we'll only allow so much if it's, we don't want to impede the ability to do it, but we also want to be mindful of the, overwhelming concern that we don't want them megawatt scale in the residential.
Sure, and I think, the final answer to that question would have to come from your municipal attorney, but based on the contractors that we work with, Pace Land Use Law Center in Westchester is our primary one for this issue. Yes, you should be able to put that sort of capacity stipulation as part of those overlay zones or as part of those floating zones, but you would want the final sign off from the municipal attorney before submitting that to Department of State.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and I assume that we can, if you're looking at that as an option, that could result in a number of smaller capacity battery storage systems rather than a single large one, for example. And you can also then consider, there are other impacts besides that we really need to take care of, such as proximity to major thoroughfares, for example. If you have something sited on the site, the edge of Sunrise Highway, and that's the only way in and out of the south, the east end. And there is an event, a fire which burns for days, and that area that's shut down. That's on 10 on South Fork.
Sure, I think it's at least up for debate whether an energy storage fire would shut down the road like that. I certainly don't think, given the work of the working group, that is inevitable or certainly necessary. But as we know, a lot of things are often done out of an abundance of caution, specifically when there is kind of a fear or a lack of understanding. But yes, you could keep that in mind, but I think if you were going to create land use regulations that way, then it would take a lot of due diligence to find out, okay, what is the actual threat, to quantify that, to be able to prove that in some way, to be able to make a database decision of how far away from the major thoroughfares we're allowed to site how much energy storage, rather than just purely reacting to things that aren't based in fact and data and science.
Okay, fair enough, thank you.
Yeah, I think the Office of Fire Prevention and Control at the state level, I believe, said that the maximum clearance, and this is for smoke, it's not for fire, would be 300 feet downwind is what the most recent guidance that I heard from their office was. So at the very least, that could be a starting point, but I don't know, how that would interact with thoroughfares because, not like anyone is kind of living there, right? It's theoretically, although I have been out there many times, and I know that oftentimes cars are just sitting on Sunrise Highway out there. You would want to take that into account, that theoretically people would be moving, and therefore their exposure to that smoke would be inherently limited. You know, it's just important to think through all of these factors, and then arrive at the best regulation that you can based on the information that you have.
Bill, may I ask your knowledge on the FDNY's codes and zonation of stationary battery energy storage? I understand they allow them on rooftops, and they're allowed throughout the city. Could you speak more to that, and maybe it would give us some guidance, since they're the gold standard on this?
Sure, yeah. New York City allows energy storage all throughout the city. Certain size projects in zoning districts are zoned as of right, which means that you don't need a variance or a special use permit. That was actually new as part of Mayor Adams' City of Yes initiative. And within that City of Yes initiative, the City of New York, through the Department of City Planning, took many steps to actually make it easier to site energy storage from a zoning perspective. And I think a lot of that is because they do have the confidence of having one of the country's most well-resourced AHJs to be doing the inspections and vetting these projects. So there is that difference, but since the early days in 2017, 2018, when the Department of City Planning first started looking at this technology and they declared it utility use group, since then they've evolved, and they've evolved in one direction, and that's to make it easier to site storage, to have more places to site storage, and not more restrictive.
And that's up to 80 kilowatt hours?
No, for residential districts, I believe they're up to 5 megawatts as of right. And then when you go over 5 megawatts, then you have to go through the zoning board, the city's equivalent to the zoning board, the city planning commission, and then you have to go through the community board as well. So it's just additional process. It's not that they're banning over 5 megawatts in residential. It's just not as of right anymore. So you have to jump through a few more hoops to be able to cite something larger than that in a residential district.
We should also add that they have paid fire service.
Yes, there are a lot of differences, and not just the fire service, but the, inspecting project plans. They also have a Department of Buildings, so it's not just the fire department who's making, they have another set of eyes inspecting projects. FDNY does 3 inspections. They go out and inspect the fire alarms and the fire suppression systems. They go out separately and inspect the ventilation, the thermal management, and the exhaust. And then they do the final inspection for the energy storage system through their bulk fuel safety unit, BFSU. So they, it's not just FDNY's capability to respond to a fire. It's also FDNY as an AHJ, as the person who's reviewing the project application, inspecting the finished project. They have a lot of advantages in all of those areas, and it's very important to keep that in mind. We do not expect the rest of the state to operate at the level of FDNY and the resources available to them. So when we say that we're taking FDNY's regulations and trying to adapt them to the rest of the state, that's really what we mean. How do we take what FDNY is doing and distill it in such a way that can be done in places where there are volunteer fire service? Where can NYSERDA step in? Where can OFPC step in? Those are the things that the folks in the Fire Safety Working Group are thinking about.
Thank you. Does anyone else have questions?
John, Ryan, anything you wanted to add at this point?
Nothing just yet, I mean,
Well, why don't we, set a date for the next time we can meet, maybe in 3 weeks, and in the meantime, it would be great to get that proposed map from Gary. What was it, he said you had a map that had proposed locations.
Well, it wasn't proposed locations, he said it was a distribution map of how much, like, you can inject, right? Like, can you clarify
A
what
map
you were
of
talking about?
distribution centers or stations?
Yeah, that's what I
Hosting
thought you said.
capacity, I think you called it. Is there a technical term for that, what you said earlier, Gary?
The hosting capacity?
Yeah. Thank you. So will you two still continue to participate with us as we have further meetings? Great.
What about the zoning tools that, that Bill mentioned? Is that something we can avail ourselves of?
The zoning tool, the model code?
I don't know, he said they had a zoning tool, that you could, you know, look at the different locations, like say, you're not gonna have them in residential unless it was, right next to a substation, in which case you could.
Oh, the floating zone. Yeah, do you
Yeah.
have any maybe we could talk offline, Bill, if you can give us any examples of that. And like I said, with, the capacity stipulation there, because
Yeah,
we wouldn't wanna then recreate the same thing that everybody
No.
went crazy over, so that would
Yeah,
not be
You're
good.
talking like a
If
scalable,
we
like
have
a
it at
scalable
all,
code?
have a capacity.
Well, a floating zone overlay is something where you don't necessarily, someone applies and potentially to the town board to land that, and then you could say, you could only apply if it's, 5 or 10 megawatt, not 100 megawatt. You'd have to say this is the cap to that as one of the standards for landing it. And we're very familiar with floating zone overlays, but we can talk more offline with
Are
Bill
there
about
any
that.
other examples out there too with a more scaled code as opposed to just, 600 and above? That's it. It's just so open-ended. And I think one of the takeaways from the conversation today too is a lot of the things that we were talking about had to do with, comfort level, safety, need for an area, and like scalability. So if there's anybody out there that's, that we're familiar with, or that anybody on here is familiar with, that's already taken that approach where it's, the example given before was, like 0 to 80 residential, 80 to 600, commercial, over 600 type, utility scale or whatever. But I'm wondering if is another jurisdiction out there that's created that throttling of stuff that we could then look at and say, okay, like we like that scale.
Right.
Now let's figure out where we want to put that scale.
Right, and that is what we're
know?
doing. And we
Right.
did do that, except that we just said in excess of 600 kilowatt hour. And the questions, I think, today, then the next threshold really comes to 25 megawatt. So is there something between 600 kilowatt and 25 megawatt? I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of room there
Oh,
for us to say.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Okay.
I think you might need like, you may need to do that 0 to 80, 80 to 600, 600 to 5,
We already
5
actually-
to 20, whatever it is.
To be clear, we have the 0 to 80 and the 80 to 600.
In red.
And then the moratorium is really on this code about 600 and above. So we can take this code then and then say 600 to, I'm just guessing here, and this is not a final answer, but let's say 5 megawatt. It's
Yeah.
these parameters, and they can go
Right.
here. And then 5 to 20, 5 to 10 is this way, and 10 to 25 is like that. And that's, I think, what we'll drill down on as we move forward.
Do you know of any other municipalities that have that kind of staggering scale in place already?
Most municipalities have split those tiers toward the bottom end of just, we're gonna do residential, small commercial. I haven't seen anyone, and not that I've reviewed every law in the state. I think the last time I reviewed every law in the state was about a year ago, last May or June. So it has been a while. But I find that typically, the folks who are making different stipulations for larger systems are just to ban them. And as I explained before, I don't think that is a good idea, or really a tenable idea in a lot of situations that you might find yourself in. So not off the top of my head, but I think, where we set up capacity thresholds in the model solar law, I think they also kind of make sense for storage, and that's very rare. We almost always have to treat these as two completely different things, but those capacity thresholds and the way they're split up for the solar law could actually port over to storage pretty well. because we also factor in the accessory use or the principal use when splitting that up for solar law. So, as you said, in industrial districts, you might have a 1 megawatt behind the meter, and that might be much more appropriate because that's serving the interests of the businesses in your community directly on their property in an industrial zone. So that accessory use might be more acceptable, whereby the same size system that's connected directly to a substation in, say, a residential district might be a little, less appropriate or less agreeable to the community. The solar law does that. It splits up between accessory and principal at the 1 megawatt threshold, so that works really well for storage as well. And then they also cut off at 20 in the model solar law, 20 megawatts. Which if you want something to ground your decision for storage, that might be a good way to justify that.
That's great. That's a great suggestion.
All right, do you think you have a proposed date for the next meeting that we could?
I don't, but I just wanted to also ask, we were talking about having a stakeholder engagement and potentially doing it down in the auditorium here, maybe putting up these maps that we can discuss and around the room and have people, kind of weigh in a less formal setting than just 3 minutes at the podium. And we just want to kind of see if we can arrange such a thing.
Yeah, I think it would be good, though, to look about these tiers first and get something that we're want to roll out rather than just at
No,
this point,
right, but I mean,
pretty open.
I wouldn't want it to be a foregone conclusion by the time you invite the public, right? So it would be nice to have earlier input as well. So whatever you think we can do, I just want to note that I go back to the Suffolk County Planning Commission on May 1st. That's really the 3-month mark.
Wow, it's been
Yeah, and so we have to kind of move a little more rapidly, unless you want to extend it potentially further, which is up to the board, you and the board. But if we can maybe meet every couple of weeks until we iron this out, and then get
although
something on the
it's 2
books,
weeks
maybe.
is after.
Well, I will go back to them and let them know what we've done here. It's really just a status update.
Yeah.
Moratorium is still till August. So
Okay.
but I promised I'd come back, and I will. So we need to keep our friends in the county happy, so I'll
Yeah.
go back to them. But if we could pick a date in May for this group, and then maybe a tentative, agreement that we'd like to choose a date in June, potentially for the public engagement.
Or even the end of May, yeah.
That's fine, whatever you think. I just want to bring
Yeah,
that
we
up to the
could
group
keep it
here
up.
and get that on the books.
Right.
Yeah, and one thing that I would just want to add to that is, a lot of this is like obviously a zoning land use kind of conversation. where would these facilities be best located, suited? But obviously, as we started off the conversation talking about, the other aspect of this is, and the reason that we're really kind of having these conversations is the whole, the safety side of it and the fire safety side of it. So just to kind of, I think, manage expectations a little bit or just put it out there, I'm sure that the changes to the state fire code, which we, whether or not based on, NFPA 855, we're also simultaneously recognizing that basis is probably about 4 years old at this point, and there's been a lot of changes since then. So although it may have been well intentioned in the beginning that, based off of 855, it's catching up to itself, and it's just being, put into I-code, and then the state has to adopt it, then come down to locals from there. So that whole process won't be, we won't necessarily be in a comfortable, like, fire safety point with the most up-to-date code references and standards in the code probably by that point yet either. So even if we've, figured out a way to kind of cite these things in a proper area, I don't know that we'll still, on the fire safety side, have gotten to a comfortable code point with it quite yet. It's in conversation and it's on its way there, but by the time it goes through the state approval processes and everything else, we may want to just kind of keep that in mind too.
Yeah, because even the state, they're not going to have the other
Right.
comments out till the fall, they said. So-
Exactly, yeah. By the time it goes out for code review and public comment on the code review side, gets adopted on the state uniform fire and building code side, there's still more of a lag there. And we would want anything that was going to be put into these places that we then deem to be appropriate to be at the highest standard possible.
Sure thing.
So how do we jive that with the moratorium, because it's gonna expire before?
Well, the
we have
moratorium
all
on
that in
this code,
place?
if you enacted a new code after this period, that's not that code, then it would be different. There would be no expiration. So you could potentially say, we're only allowing, up to whatever, choose a number until such
We
time
could
that these things come out.
Be more
And-
restrictive until everything else is fleshed
Yeah.
out with the fire
and then,
safety.
kind of
Or
a
less
phased
safety.
approach, maybe, worth thinking about was what I'm saying. And I don't know if anyone's ever done that, but it's sort of like incremental planning. That's what it sounds like to me, anyway.
Yeah.
Kind of just wanted to jump in there, because one thing that the analysis of the fire safety working group found pretty definitively is that the current regulations for energy storage development are not really lacking. The issues that, arose and what was identified through that analysis was much more that the regulations were not being enforced adequately, the regulations were not being followed, than it was there was any hole in the regulations. And if you take, the 2024 International Fire Code is available right now. If you take that, I believe it's section 1207, and do a side-by-side comparison with New York State's 1206 in the fire code, which is the energy storage section, you'll see that there's not a whole lot that changed between the two iterations. There are some things that were a bit different, but really from the fire code side, it's much more about enforcement. And as the local jurisdiction exercising your optional powers that the fire code gives to you. For instance, the fire code gives you an option to require a peer review of the application. So, if you're the AHJ and this is your first or even your fifth time reviewing an energy storage system project application and all those manufacturer specs and everything, nobody's going to be excellent at that their first time, even their fifth time. So the code gives you the power to require the developer to pay for someone to come in and help you with that, to do the peer review of the application. Same thing with a fire remediation team. The code gives you the authority to require that the developer contract with a sort of a fire brigade to relieve the local fire service because these fires can go on. So a lot of the fire code as it is, based on the findings of the working group, was not so much the issue. Sure, there was room for improvement, and that's what those recommendations are. But it's really making sure that you are enforcing the current fire code. We'll do a whole lot more to ensure safe development than waiting for the next iteration, which would still have the core problem, right? You still have to enforce that locally. So it's going to be an enforcement issue, whether it's this code or the next code. And I think that, should probably get significant attention.
I think the working group made some very decent suggestions that to change some of the requirements of the code, whether it had to do with response personnel, whether it had to do with explosion control and monitoring, even the suggestion about the peer evaluation, that were well outside of a lack of enforcement, that those were suggestions to the plans required with a facility such as this or other features too. So I don't think it's purely just lacking on enforcement. It was there were some solid suggestions within the interagency working groups proposals that dealt with improvements that could be made based on lessons learned and knowledge that we have now.
I should also let folks know that I'm one of the primary authors of that document, the fire code recommendations. Most of it was from IFC 24 and what the city is doing. There were very few things that were actually brand new. One of them was video surveillance. That was unprecedented. That was one thing that the working group got together and said, this is a really great idea that nobody has come up with yet. A lot of the other recommendations there were just kind of tweaks to what was in the IFC, what was in the 855. And then there, were a couple things that were optional that are now, the fire safety working group is saying, we'll make them mandatory, like the peer review. Right now, that's optional. All you have to do is require it, and it's, then it's there. What the fire safety working group said is every project, every time. We're going to remove the optionality from it. So it's a lot of little tweaks, and I don't think, having spent most of the last year of my life focused solely on this, I don't really think that there is that much in the next iteration that is going to be a sea change from what we have currently in the 2020 fire code. The reason I bring up the enforcement piece is because whether you're enforcing the 2020 uniform code or the 2024 uniform code, there still is that kind of responsibility at the local level to make sure that these regulations are being followed. Because as with any regulations, they're really only as good as their enforcement.
Thank you.
So how about like May 7th? That's 2 weeks from today.
Yeah, that would be perfect for me
And
anyway.
same time,
Does anybody
type of thing.
else?
1 to 2:30 for the next sort of drill down, and at that point we'll have maybe some more. We'll look at the specific language of the code and the specific parcels in 2 weeks. Does that
Chief,
sound
are you free?
I'm good.
I just-
You
I
have a
think,
legend.
Ann?
With all due respect, I think it's really important that we start hearing from the public before we start looking at the code. Because we can be at this all day and we can have what we feel is right, but I can tell you that having gone through the public hearings and the public comments, when we entered into this moratorium, it was from a place of people not feeling safe and people being really scared and people not knowing what we were talking about, and in all honesty, us not knowing what we were talking about. So I really think it's important that before we start discussing, where these things should go and what we should do, I think it's really important for this group to hear from the public and hear their concerns before we move forward, because we're gonna end up in the same place where we've crafted a code that we feel is correct, and we've worked with the state, and we've worked with the involved agencies, but the people at the end of the day are still going to be fearful, and they are still not gonna want these things cited where we feel they need to go. And until we have that buy-in from the public, I think we're on a losing end game here, because we are going to end up in the same place we were before the moratorium.
But I
if we
think that the
don't have
whole
buy-in.
point was that we're taking all the residential zones out of the equation at the moment and then talking about the parameters around industrial and business zones.
So
Um,
what happens when you have an industrial zone that's 50 feet from a school?
Well, right, we would have to take a look at that, and that's what we're talking about drilling down closer in on the, like, okay, we can all agree potentially that the community is, you've heard, and we've all been to the public hearings and heard in the paper and everywhere else, they don't want megawatt scale in a residential zone. So that's the first easiest sort of fix, is to take that out and then say, okay, well then what's left? And then looking at what's left, saying, okay, this may be an LI zone, but it abuts, a residential neighborhood, so, and then getting more granular is what we're saying. And then obviously, like I just said, scheduling a stakeholder engagement where we put like a maps all around the room and have people kind of be able to see and look at where we're talking about would be much more productive. So that was the idea there.
If I may interject, I have put together a summary of the comments that have been put together by the town clerk. I have read through many comments from the public. I've looked at the postcards and the letters. I created a summary for our office. Maybe something in between, as opposed to inviting the public back in before this meeting. We can look at together after this meeting at what's been said, what are their concerns, so that we we refamiliarize ourselves with exactly what the public is saying.
And, processing what we've learned at today's meeting and how we can propose something, in general, and then get that additional feedback. I think I'd like to.
Yeah, because if you don't really come up with anything, it'll be, we told you already. We didn't want, I don't want to start at zero when we already know sort of those things, except for the, certain segments and we know how people feel about the residential, megawatt scale in residential zones. It's pretty clear.
Yeah.
I will have to Zoom in if I can, if it's May 7th from
That's
1
fine.
to
We'll,
2:30.
again, create it the same way.
Yeah, I just have.
We'll be
lunch
looking
meeting.
up at
How about
yeah.
you, Bill and Gary? Can you come back on the 7th to participate once more? Do we need them to participate? Do we want them?
George, are you available on the 7th? At 1? Oh, I think you're muted.
Was that directed at me?
No, it was at George.
Got it, sorry.
Unmute, George, let me know.
I think you're muted
Nah,
still.
still muted.
But Bill, to you, the hosting capacity information would be important for our next meeting because by our map, we don't even know if we have enough non-residential sites that are close enough to hosting capacity sites. So it would be important to know where the hosting capacity sites are.
Yeah.
Can we get our GIS people to talk to your GIS or whoever you use for spatial?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, and I can make the 7th.
Great.
Oh, good,
Thank
thanks. And then if we did need your expertise, Bill and Gary, are you both available to Zoom in on those dates, that date? May 7th at 1?
I'm not available on the 7th, but I can certainly get someone from my team to hop on the line.
Okay,
And yes, I am.
Okay.
I'm available at 1 on the 7th.
all right, we'll be back in touch with you between now and then.
Yep, we'll send the links out again, thank you. And then we can, the last is just, moving forward, that's that, and just when, we can kind of find out, maybe at the next board meeting with the other board members, when you'd like to schedule the, community engagement.
Yeah, we shortly thereafter, within a couple of weeks.
The more we know in advance, the better we can plan for it.
I mean, we could just pick a date now.
That's what I was hoping.
Gary, I just wanted to clarify two things with you. You said the East Hampton and the Montauk site are both 5s?
Yes.
5 megawatt?
Yes.
Okay.
All 5
And
megawatts.
I know where the East Hampton site is. Can you tell me where the Montauk site is?
I don't know exactly in terms of street address and all that. I can
Uh,
send that information over to you.
That'd be great, thank you.
Yes.
Would it make sense to do it at the date of our town board meeting after the meeting? Because, well, it's kind of
I
late.
wouldn't recommend that.
No, just because
Maybe on a Wednesday,
we don't have
there
to
doesn't
schedule a
s-
special meeting.
No, on a Wednesday, it's not a special board meeting. I mean, you wouldn't be voting or hearing testimony. It's just more of a poster session.
Mhm.
You want to do it in the evening, right?
Yeah. Like the 22nd or 29th. Well, 29th is getting a little close to Memorial Day weekend. Actually,
After.
Let's do
oh, actually, Memorial Day's early this year. It's
Yeah,
the 27th.
27th.
the 22nd would be all right.
22nd?
Yeah, or the 21st.
I mean, there's nothing stopping you from having more than one public engagement, but we just want to have at least one on the books. So we can call
Or
this.
the
a-
21st is open too, either way.
You may have. Is there any boards
The
meeting?
22nd works for me.
Okay, so we'll call it a public engagement, sort of poster session, and we'll have maps and an ability to just have a more informal meeting down in the auditorium where folks can come in and, you know, and maybe we can schedule some presentations, I don't know, we can talk about that, but
What time do you think is best for the community?
I would say after work,
6?
sure.
What do you think about that, Councilwoman McNamara, 6?
That sounds good.
I just attended a session like this where I think it was for 2 hours or an hour and a half, but at each, like, top and bottom of the hour, they did a quick presentation. So it was a combination presentation and poster session, and it was fairly
For people who arrive a little
impactful.
bit later. Okay, that's a good idea, Anne.
So just a
Thanks.
thought.
Yeah.
Great, that would be great. So we'll work through that and set that up. And put
set
that
the-
out. push
You'll
that
get
out.
us the summary of the comments in the
I
meantime,
shall,
too?
and I will get you the recommendations that we've been speaking about, the fire code recommendations.
Yeah.
And anything else you need, I've compiled many, many documents, and I'd be happy to shoot them out.
Great, George just needs the maps emailed, and we'll post them on
Absolutely.
our website as well.
Thank you for
Yeah,
reminding me.
that's good.
Great. If there's nothing, is there
Thank
anything?
you for putting this together, and thank you for including me in this, and thank you to our guests for a great deal of education
Yeah.
this afternoon.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody, for participating on this important topic. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.